I think it stopped. Ah, okay.
Okay. Again, this is Zoom. So we are really proud to have Professor Blakesley talk to us about translation and poetry. I'll introduce him before he speaks for about 40 minutes or more, and then we'll have a Q&A session for you to comment or to ask questions. Jacob Blakesley is an associate professor at the University of Leeds. He just told us that he was born in Seattle, United States. He co-directs the Leeds Center for Dante Studies. His PhD was in Italian literature. Jacob teaches classes in comparative literature and translation studies. He's also a practicing translator. He translates from Italian into English, and also translated poetry from a number of languages into English. His publications include Monograph, a sociological approach to poetry translation, published 2018. Monograph, Modern Italian Poets, Translators of the Impossible, 2014. Edited volume, Sociologies of Poetry Translation, 2018. He's currently working on a book about the global translation history and reception of Dante's Divine Comedies. He lives in Italy. He's now in Italy with his family, and a little bird told me that he and his children are very psyched for tonight's football match between Italy and Switzerland. Palestinians have always been fans of Italy, so go Italy.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for this really kind and generous introduction, Rafat. It's really an honor for me to be here, at least virtually, with all of you. I hope one day to meet in person. That would be really wonderful. I'm going to talk, as Rafat said. I'll give my lecture, but I'm happy if while I'm talking, if you have any questions, feel free to just open your mics and ask me a question, and then we'll also have questions afterwards. And I'm happy if you, after the talk, after the session, if you have more questions, you can write me by email. Very happy to respond. So let me just try to share my screen. Okay. Can you, let me just, there we go. Can you all see my screen okay?
Just there.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to be talking about poetry translation today in a number of, using a number of different poems from various traditions. But I just wanted to start off really with a couple explanations about translation in general, because, well, some people have called translation the most complicated act in the entire universe, because if you think about what's theoretically required to translate one sentence from one language and which is a culture into another language and culture, and you start trying to think about the different processes that go into that and the different ways in which it can happen, well, it's very complicated. And all the more so when we deal with poetry. The other complication about translation is that there are many ways to translate, and there's not simply one correct way to translate a sentence. Even the most simplest sentence in the world, like I'm opening the door, can be translated into one language in a variety of different ways, all of which may be correct depending on the readership or the audience or the context that we're talking about. So translation is always a question of multiple meanings, because every text, every work of art, like a poem, has many layers of meaning, because a poem has often rhyme. It's written in specific poetic meters. There's different types of imagery or rhetoric in a poem. There's many different layers. There's metaphors, multiple types of meaning. So now let me then go through a couple definitions of poetry, and then a few definitions of poetry translation. So The American poet from Chicago, Carl Sandburg, 20th century poet, said, "The poetry is a tracing of the trajectories of a finite sound to the infinite points of its echoes." What I like about Sandburg's definition is that it's alluding to the fact that there are infinite points, there are infinite really meanings in a text of poetry. And so when you're thinking about translating it or analyzing somebody's translation, you have to think about all the different possible meanings in a poetic text. Robert Frost, the 20th century American poet, famously said, "Poetry is what gets lost in translation." So according to Frost, poetry can't be translated properly. But I'll today be really saying that poetry is translatable. So Dante Alighieri, who wrote a great poem, which we'll be looking at later on during this talk, The Divine Comedy, about 7 centuries ago in the 1300s said, "And therefore everyone should know that nothing harmonized according to the rules of poetry can be translated from its native tongue, its native language, into another without destroying all its sweetness and harmony." So Dante here is saying the poetry cannot be translated. It's impossible to translate poetry, like Robert Frost would say, as we just saw 700 years later. A few centuries after Dante, in the 1600s, the English poet and translator John Dryden said that poetry translation is possible as long as the translator is a poet. So to be a thorough translator, he must be a thorough poet. So poetry translation is possible only if you are a poet. Robert Browning, the British poet from the late 1800s, spoke about poetry translation as, in his view, advocating that you stay very close to the source text. You, as a translator, should be literal. You shouldn't be free. But this idea would then be criticized by some other poets who were translators, as we'll shortly see. Now, Ezra Pound, the great modernist American poet, in 1917 spoke about 3 different kinds of poetry, and he called them melopeia, phanopia, and logopeia, and they referred to the musical quality of poetry, melopeia, the imagery in poetry, which he called phanopia, and what he called was the dance of the intellect among words, logopeia. So basically, the richness of language. So these 3 different types of poetry for Ezra Pound. And Pound said that each of these 3 different types of poetry, these 3 aspects of poetry, of a poem, can be translated some well and some badly. So for the musical aspect, melopeia, Ezra Pound says it's practically impossible to translate from one language to another, except perhaps by divine accident and for half a line at a time. Whereas for Ezra Pound, phanopia, the imagery in a poem, can be translated almost or wholly. However, logopeia, so what he referred to as a dance of the intellect or the verbal element in poetry, does not translate according to Pound. And you could think about this also in relation, if you think about one of your favorite poems, think about how the imagery might be translatable from, for example, from Arabic to English without a loss of much meaning, but how the musical aspects of Arabic in English cannot be translated. So Paul Valéry, a famous French poet from the 20th century, really criticized Browning's view about translating literally poetry. So for Valéry, if you are faithful or literal to the meaning, the referential meaning of the poem, well, then you're betraying the poem. This is not, you're not being faithful to the poem, because poetry is more than about referential or semantic meaning. Think about just the word tree or stone. You can think of, if you think of a tree, you can think of different types of trees, but the word tree in a poem can have multiple meanings. For example, if it's a rhyme word at the end, then that has a specific importance. Or if there's assonance or alliteration where either the vowels or the consonants of like tr are being repeated throughout a few different lines, then that musical aspect might be what you should be paying attention to. Roman Jakobson, who was an influential critic and translation scholar, said that poetry is untranslatable. He said only creative transposition is possible, but Jakobson doesn't define what this transposition means. So again, this isn't a very helpful definition, although this essay on linguistic aspects of translation is very foundational for the field of translation studies. The important mid-20th century American poet Robert Lowell speaks really harshly against American translators who were translating poetry into meter and rhyme, because at that point in time, in 1962, American poetry, the most influential contemporary American poetry, was written in free verse. So in verse that did not have rhyme or specific poetic meters. And so what Robert Lowell was saying is that these strict metrical translators who translate into verse and rhyme and meter still exist, but it's as though their poems are artificial, their translations are artificial. They seem like stuffed birds because these poems don't have the life, the vitality that come from contemporary poetic language that should just be in free verse. The famous Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov, right around the time that Lowell wrote about poetry translation, Nabokov translated the great 19th century Russian poem Eugene Onegin, written by Pushkin, from Russian into English. And Nabokov says that he sacrificed everything, all of the sort of musical elements of poetry, because he was aiming just for what he says is completeness of meaning, to literalism, the same thing that Robert Browning was advocating, wanted earlier, as we saw. However, Nabokov's translation, in fact, is quite unreadable in English because there is no elegance, good taste, or euphony in his translation. So now I wanted to introduce briefly the notions you may have already come across of foreignization and domestication, which have been especially discussed thanks to the American translation scholar of the late 20th century, who's still around, Lawrence Venuti. He came up with this dichotomy, these two choices of foreignization and domestication. For Venuti, a domesticating translation conforms to target culture values, so it doesn't disrupt the reader. There's a lot of adaptation involved in a domesticating translation. It can seem as though the text that is translated was originally written in your language. So a domesticating translation in English, for example, would change any cultural element from other cultures into something that English language people would recognize. And this is characterized by what Venuti calls fluency, and it's the most its domestication is the most prevalent or the most hegemonic or the most used translation strategy in the English language world nowadays. And publishers don't want you as a translator to do a foreignized translation because they're afraid that readers won't buy a translation that makes them have to do extra work to understand the source text and the source culture. Venuti, so if that's domestication, foreignization, a foreignizing translation is where, as a translator, you're challenging the norms and the expectations of your target language readers. So that might be using words from the source text, from the source language, or not changing cultural elements, or in any case, practicing resistancy. And we'll see how this relates, this dichotomy of domestication and foreignization in just a little bit. But I just wanted to very, very briefly, I don't know if any of you know the great American poet, Emily Dickinson, from the 19th century, one of the greatest poets of all time. But just to show you what the difficulties in poetry translation, very briefly. So this poem is a poem in which the narrator, well, we can just read the first stanza. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. So Emily Dickinson, the narrator of this poem, is imagining a trip through a cemetery in which she is in a horse and a carriage, and she's in a carriage with two other figures. One is death and the other is immortality. And then the final stanza, since then to centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Well, she's referring here to the grave in the ground. And so death in this poem, she's imagining as a sort of suitor, somebody who is wooing her, somebody who, a suitor is somebody who, like a man who wants to marry a woman. And so he goes and buys her flowers and so forth. And so the problem with this poem in translation is the fact that death in this poem is imagined as masculine. So you can see the red highlighted terms here. He kindly stopped for me. He knew no haste. His civility. So what do you do when death in your in the language into which you're translating is not a masculine figure but feminine? So for example, in Romance languages, in French and Italian and Spanish, it's Italian. It's feminine. So for example, I'm translating with an Italian poet some poems by Emily Dickinson, and the problem is, well, how do we translate death? Because if we translate it as feminine, then we lose the aspect of death courting or suiting or having an interest in the narrator poets. These are issues that come up in translation, grammatical gender. And so in a language like Arabic, for example, I believe the word for death is masculine. Is that correct, Rifat? And so you wouldn't necessarily have a problem, but in a Romance language, you do have the problem of gender in translation. Now I wanted to briefly talk about a few of the different categories of poetry translation. So as you can see, two theorists at the bottom here, Lefebvre and Holmes, have spoken about 6 different types, and we'll go through them very briefly so that we can talk about the ways in which poetry is translated. So there's mimetic translation, which uses the same verse form. There's analogical translation, which uses an equally prestigious or important verse form in the target language. There's organic translation, in which there is no specific form for the poetry translation. It just depends on the content. There's phonemic translation, where the sound is reproduced, but not the meaning. There's prose translation, and then there's imitation or adaptation. So mimetic translation is translation, as I said, written in the same meter or formally similar meter. And this happens a lot, for example, in Russian poetry and the translation of Russian poetry into English, where whatever rhyming scheme is used in Russian, in the original Russian poem, the English language translator will use in English. And that's mimetic translation. The problem with that is that if poetry, how should we say, if the verse forms that are now used in poetry are much different, then there is no correspondence between, I mean, in Russian, you still use verse forms. You use a lot of rhyming poetry, but in English, that seems very out of date and anachronistic, as though it came from the 1800s. So a more effective translation than mimetic translation would be analogical translation, where you use the equivalent, sort of the prestigious meter in the target language. So another example might be the sonnet, which is one of the most popular verse forms in the Western tradition, which is four stanzas, 14 lines. And it was started in Italy by before Dante, but one of the main practitioners in Italy was Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca. So in English, our most prestigious verse form is called the iambic pentameter, which is a verse form of 10 syllables, whereas in Italian, their most prestigious verse form, in which Petrarch wrote, is an 11-syllable verse. So it's slightly different, 11 to 10. But if we do 11 syllable verse translation in English, it sounds very bizarre and very odd. So an analogical translation of Petrarch would be into 10 syllable verse form. This is the third category, organic translation, where there is no form. This is originally, this is a translation of a very famous Chinese poem, Tang poem from the 600s, so about 1500 years ago. And the American poet Kenneth Rexroth translated this in the mid-1950s, I believe. But this was in Chinese 4 verses. And in his American translation, it's 7 verses. And well, we'll look a bit at Chinese poetry later on, but just to show you that there's no verse or rhyme in this translation. It's just the content of the poem itself. This is a prose translation of the opening of the great Latin epic poem called the Aeneid, written by Virgil 2000 years ago. But Virgil wrote in Latin hexameter poetry that was rhymed. And so David West, in his English translation, has translated into prose. So there's no verse, there's no rhyme, there's no poetic meter. And you can see then what's being left out. This is an interesting type of translation called phonemic translation. This is the Roman poet Catullus, who wrote about 2000 years ago as well. You can see at the top there is the Latin of Catullus, which I'll just read very so that you can, because the phonemic translation aims to reproduce the sound of the text. So try to listen to the Latin in my pronunciation. So nulli se dicit mulier mea nubere male, qua mihi non si se iupeter ipsi petat. Dicit, sed mulier cupido qua dicit amanti, invento ed rapida scribere oportet aqua. Now, a literal translation is the second stanza there, which I provided. So, no one, my woman says, would want to marry more than me, not even if the god Jupiter himself asked. She says, but what a woman tells a passionate lover should be written on wind and in rapid water. So Louis and Celia Zukowski. Louis Zukowski was an avant-garde American poet from the 20th century. Celia was his wife. They translated this not aiming for the semantic meaning of the text, so what it's referring to in reality, as it were, but rather to the phonic. So you remember the first 3 words of Catullus's poem, nulli se dicit. In the translation, it's nulli se dicert. So you can see here how the Latin sound is reproduced in the English translation. Now, it doesn't, you're losing a lot of the what we would call the referential or semantic meaning of the text, but at the same time, the sound quality of Catullus comes through. So it's an interesting way of translation. Another category, the second to last of poetry translation, is imitation. So on the left, you have a poem by the French poet Pierre Ronsard from the 16th century. And on the right, you have the Nobel Prize winner W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet from the late 19th century. I put everything in red. It has not been translated by Yeats. So as you can see, Yeats is very faithful to the first stanza, the first 4 lines. When you are old and gray and full of sleep, quand vous serez bien vieille au soir la chandelle, that's the original French. But then the second, third, and fourth stanzas really are not translated by Yeats at all. And he just invents those last 2 stanzas. How many loved your moments of glad grace, blah, blah, blah. So this is why we would say it's an imitation, because it has a bit of translation, but it's also an original composition. So there's many different reasons for choosing target forms, and you can see that is in translation. You can see some of the elements here, but I'll move on now to talk a little bit about, very briefly, the difficulties in translating poetry in terms of the physical shape of poetry. Look at this poem by the French avant-garde poet Guillaume Apollinaire, written at the beginning of the 20th century. So La Tour Eiffel, so the Eiffel Tower. Salut, salut monde, je suis la langue éloquente que sa bouche au Paris tire et tirera toujours aux Allemands So this has been translated into English as greetings, earth, of which I am the eloquent tongue, which pokes from your mouth, O Paris, and will poke forever at the Germans. Because this was written during World War I, and Apollinaire was fighting in World War I and ultimately died there. But you can see how the shape of this poem is, and I don't know if anybody's ever seen the Eiffel Tower. It's a very tall tower in Paris. So the poem is written in that shape. So this is why it's called, we call it concrete poetry, because of the way in which the shape of the poem reflects what is being said in the poem. And so that's part of the meaning of this poem in translation, which is very difficult to get across, but which has been done very well in this translation. One way of theoretical way of trying to make up for what you lose when you're translating poetry is called compensation. So if you're unable as a poetry translator to translate an image or use rhyme in a specific place, the theoreticians have talked about using compensation. So making up for one type of textual effect in the source text by another type, or using different sounds in different places, etc. What Peter Newmark, the translation theorist, has said is that compensation is a procedure which in the last resort ensures that translation is possible. Okay, are there any questions so far? Anybody want to speak up before I move on?
You spoke about adaptation,
Yes.
Jacob, as one technique of like domestication. I believe I will just cite one example, but it doesn't relate to history. But it was like I believe a translation of one of Shakespeare's plays where the word fates was mentioned, and the translator. Actually, I believe the word refers to 3 goddesses in English.
Yes.
So when it was translated into Arabic, it was translated as al-aqdar, which literally means fates in English. So sometimes I believe like even the domestication in which we use adaptation in this case will entail like a significant loss of the cultural background of the original text or the source text. I mean, what is your advice in this regard? I gave like an example away from poetry, but I think in a way it could relate to this. I mean, I'm not familiar with other examples.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Mahmoud. So I think, I mean, Lawrence Venuti himself says that all translation is fundamentally domesticating, because otherwise we wouldn't understand any text. So there's always, in the 1800s, the German theorist Schleiermacher spoke about domestication or foreignization in a different way, in an earlier way, in which he said, as a translator, you're either bringing the text towards the reader, or you're bringing the reader towards the text. And if you're bringing the text towards the reader, you're domesticating the text. Whereas if you're bringing the reader towards the text, you're foreignizing the text. And I think certainly in the case of Shakespeare, I mean, it's very difficult even for native English speakers to understand the references that he uses nowadays. So that now, in fact, there are translations into contemporary English of Shakespeare's plays to make it easier to understand them. So adaptation, I think. I think that there's often instances of adaptation even in veritable translations. It's just that some translations have more adaptations than others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Dr.
Yes. So I wanted now to move on to a few different texts. So the Iliad by Homer, the great Greek poet. This was composed, as you can see, almost 3,000 years ago. This was written in unrhymed verse in dactylic hexameter, and I just wanted to show you, because this is probably the literary text, the poetic text that has been translated the most into English, as well as most Western European languages. So meninaide thea peliadio Achilleos ulomenen he muri akaios alge etheke Polas dipthymus psukas aide proiapson eron, autus de eloroia teuke kunessen oinoisi te daita. Dios teleteto bule. Exude ta prota diasteten erisante atreides te Anaxandron kai Dios Achilleos. So this poem is about the Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans. And this is the sort of literal translation of this opening stanza that I just read to you in Greek. The main protagonist of this poem is Achilles. And the Greeks who had multiple gods, Zeus was the chief god of the Greeks, and Hades was the Greek name for their underworld, their hell. Sorry, did somebody want to ask a question? Okay. So among the many different types of translations of the Iliad, there's some that are more domesticating in terms of their forms into English. So if we think of George Chapman's in the 1600s, Chapman is using a ballad meter, which is very common in English poetry, just like Alexander Pope a century later in the 1720s is using heroic couplets, which was the main type of poetic verse used then. And so, for example, as you can see down below the bottom of the screen, the classical scholar Richard Bentley said about Alexander Pope's poem, about his translation, "It is a pretty poem, Mr. Pope, but you must not call it Homer," because for classicists, scholars of Greek, Pope took too many liberties and was too, because heroic couplets have rhyme. So Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess sing. So spring and sing. And then you have that wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign, the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain. So by having rhyme every two, because a couplet is two verses, you have all of this, you're connecting the lines, these verses, in a way that the Greek doesn't do, because in the Greek doesn't have any rhyme. So this is a domesticating strategy that Pope used. So something like hexameter, which is the equivalent of Homer's, translated by Merrill in 2007, is more foreignizing as a translation strategy. Hexameter is 12 syllables to 18 really. But the difference is that Greek poetry used a different accentual system than the English language does. So it sounds quite odd in English. Now there's even somebody who translated Homer's Iliad into sonnets, which is an extremely domesticating way of translating it, very artificial into English. But I just wanted to show you some imitations here. Here, this is by Christopher Logue, an English translator who in 2002 translated most of the Iliad, but he didn't know Greek at all. So he translated from other translations. And if you look at those first, these are the opening 4 lines of Logue's war music. And it seems very much like cinema, but it doesn't have much correspondence to what I read to you of the opening Iliad. Here we have another imitation, but this is interesting because it's by Alice Oswald, who's a classical scholar of Greek, along with being a great contemporary English poet. And what she did was to translate only the passages of the Iliad, only the parts where warriors were dying. So it's basically one soldier after another, whether a Greek on the Greek side or the Trojan side, who are dying, and she basically makes her poem just out of that, makes her translation just out of that, and she doesn't translate anything else. So it's a really powerful imitation, but it's carried out in a much more sophisticated way than Christopher Logue's war music, because she knows Greek. Okay, I'll say just a couple words about haiku in the context of domestication and foreignization. Haiku is a very famous Japanese verse, which is 3 lines. And Matsuo Basho is the most famous Japanese poet of haiku. And this haiku here, which you can see at the top of the screen in Japanese, followed by the transliteration into Japanese. So I give you the gloss translation for each of the words, Natsugusa ya, Tua mono domo ga, Yume no ato. And then at the bottom, a very literal translation of what Basho's haiku is saying. So summer grass, warriors, dreams, aftermath. So what Basho means is under the summer grass lives, are buried the dreams of warriors who fought on this grass, because he's referring to a specific battle in Japan. But haiku does not have any rhyme. And so, for example, in English, these are a few examples of haiku translated into either 1, 2, 3, or 4 line verses. But they're often translated into rhyming verses. So grave, wave, grass, pass. And again, that's very domesticating, because we expect in English, and we used to expect in English until the mid-1900s that poetry would rhyme. So that's what the readers would expect, but it's not something that's in the haiku text itself. Okay, now I'll move on to Tang poetry. We saw Wang Wei earlier, but I wanted to show you some of the ambiguity in Chinese poetry and how that affects translation into English or any other language, including Arabic. So the Chinese spoken and written during Tang period between the 600 and 900 was not inflected. There were no conjugations or declensions. If you all think about the way in which Arabic verbs are constructed, I mean, Chinese is much simpler than that. There was no required indicator in Chinese poetry or language of the subject, that is, whether it's I, you, he, or she, or the tense, so whether it's past, present, or future, or whether we're talking about singular or plural objects. And on the contrary, Chinese was very regimented or restricted in terms of rhyme. There was rhyming words, but there was also tone. Chinese is a tonal language with several different tones. And so these help to structure and give meaning to the text. And so there's this famous poem by the great Chinese Tang poet Du Fu. And you can see at the top here, I put a translation under each of these Chinese characters. But what's really interesting here is that all 5 of these translations that I give here are acceptable translations. But the difference between these translations is very big. So in the first possibility, I feel about this wretched time so badly that even flowers make me shed tears. I hate separation so much that a bird's call startles my heart. Well, let's look at number 5 for an example. Feeling time, flowers shed tears. Hating separation, a bird startles a heart. So what's going on here? What's different between these translations? Well, if we, the first translation, there's all of this first person. I feel. Flowers make me. I hate separation. The bird's call startles my heart. Whereas in the 5th translation, which is just as satisfactory as the first one, there is no first person at all. It's disappeared entirely. There's no I, there's no me. Feeling time, flowers shed tears. Hating separation, a bird startles a heart. So here it's just the flowers and the bird. Whereas in the first translation, it's all about the first person. And these are alternate translations that, depending on how you interpret the poem, can be valid. So I think it's really interesting. Okay, there's some of you might know Omar Khayyam. Has everybody ever read his Rubaiyat? Written in Persian?
In
Perhaps
Arabic
not.
and in English, not Persian.
Okay, in English, yeah.
Arabic, yeah.
In Arabic, yes, sure. I wonder how it's translated there. Maybe we can talk about it later. This Omar Khayyam was translated very famously into English in the 19th century, in the 1800s, by Edward Fitzgerald. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because in his translation, we see very clearly an Orientalist approach, where he is the British translator puts himself very up high and thinks that he can do whatever he wants with Omar Khayyam's text, because, as he says, It is an amusement to me to take what liberties I like with these Persians, who, as I think, are not poets enough to frighten one from such excursions, and who really do want a little art to shape them. That is, who write poetry, but not with a lot of sophistication, is what he means. Their religion and philosophy is soon seen through, and always seems to me cuckooed over like a borrowed thing. It's something to get out of the sweetmeat, childish Oriental world back to the vigorous North. So, this sort of a clearly Orientalist approach that unacceptable, and that makes him look down on the Persian poet whom he is translating. And so this is something you find a lot in translations when you're analyzing translations from Persian or from Arabic or from Chinese or Japanese into English or French or German, especially before the last couple of decades. But I mean, Edward Fitzgerald's translation was, it was a bestseller, and it still is sold nowadays, even though obviously he took a great amount of liberties and was unrespectful of the source text author. This is one of the famous quatrains that he, in his translation. So one moment in annihilation's waste, one moment of the well of life to taste. The stars are setting and the caravan starts for the dawn of nothing, oh make haste. So Fitzgerald is really making more of a poem that's quite sort of seize the day, atheistic poem rather than any sort of religious poem. Then I wanted to talk about the Balderization or expurgation. So this term is named after Thomas Baldler, as you can see in his version of Hamlet. Ophelia doesn't commit suicide, but she just accidentally drowns because we don't want to offend children. And I have 3 children of my own, and so it's very challenging, in fact, to think about, well, what are my children ready to read at this point? So Balderization was something that was followed by many 17th, 18th, and 19th century translators in English and French and elsewhere. And so we'll see example of this now in terms of Latin. We looked at Catullus before in terms of the Zhukovsky translators who translated just the sound, the phonic aspect of his text. But we can see this Balderization in early 20th century translations of Catullus into English. So when Catullus refers to the backs to your bottom, what literally culum, which is ass, it's translated into English around 1910, not as ass, but as tail. The vulgar term fautuit is translated as to court, like a man courting a woman, but it actually means something much more vulgar, fucks. So the same thing with the phrase novem continuas fututiones is translated 100 years ago into English as 9 hugs without a stop, 9 embraces without a stop. But you can see what the more contemporary translator does in brackets there, which is much more reflective of the vulgarity of Catullus's translation. And then in the last, the Latin there, you can see here, this is from 1912. We have Rufa of Bononia, something the wife of Menenius. So the translator here doesn't even translate the Latin because it's considered too vulgar, because the term in bold there, felat, refers to oral sex. And so the translator could not, so the translator probably self-censored himself, although it's possible as well that the publisher wouldn't have published that anyway, because it would have gone against public decency at that time in 1912, whereas now you can write that. Now, so we've just looked at really censorship of Latin texts, and there's also another type of censorship which relates to religious censorship or political censorship, and we can see that, for example, in Dante translations into Persian, into Farsi. So, I'll be very interested to know what you think about this. So, this is the case of, well, what do you do if, as a translator, you're offended, rightly so, by the source text? Do you translate the words that offend you, and that might offend your reader, or do you not translate them and omit them, or do you make them unrecognizable? So we'll look at a couple different strategies that Persian translators have done. Now, Dante's Divine Comedy is a poem written, as I said, about 700 years ago, towards the end of the Crusades, in which Dante, as a Western Italian, was unfortunately a man of his time. And so in the Divine Comedy, it's structured into a trip through hell, purgatory, and paradise, until at the end, Dante, guided by his beloved muse, Beatrice, has a vision of God. But in hell, he sees a lot of sinners, and Dante decides who sinners are based on his worldview at that time, which nowadays many of us would say, Dante, you chose the wrong people to put in there. You shouldn't have done that. But this is the poem as it is. So what do we do then if we're translating it? I hope I don't offend anybody here when I this passage in Inferno, on the right you have Dante's Italian, and on the left you have a contemporary English translation. And so the Prophet Muhammad has been placed into Inferno along with Ali. And the question is, well, what do we do if we are a Muslim translator to not offend our readership? So one Persian translator, Shojaddin Shafo, in the 1960s, he translated the whole passage in which Prophet Muhammad is tearing open his chest by getting rid of the names, so that you don't know who these sinners are in Dante's terms. Dante's calling them sinners. So the Persian reader won't know that Prophet Muhammad is being referred to here, or that Ali is being referred to here. That's one strategy that a Persian translator chose. Another Persian translator, Faridama Davidamghani, simply didn't translate those verses and censored, as it were. So those are two different strategies for dealing with objectionable material in translation. I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions or comment on that now, or if we want to prefer to talk about that afterwards. But I'm opening the floor for a second in case anybody wants to say something about it.
Dr. Muhammad, do you want to ask your question now or at the end? Can you hear me, Dr. Muhammad Had?
Yes. Okay.
Go on, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. Okay.
Oh yeah, thank you.
What I'm asking about, when you were referring to Rubaiyat al-Khayyam and translation done by Edward Fitzgerald. Okay, we found that the translator into English, or the English translator, has done many done many changes in the translation, okay, for different reasons, okay. My question is, what type of intervention, okay, or I'm not sure if the English translator was doing it for business purposes or for other reasons, okay. My question is, in general, okay, what is the type of intervention, okay, to what extent can the translator do this type of intervention or manipulation? Okay, yes. Can he, for example, do whatever he can to translate a text like this, or are there certain areas in which he cannot jump over when he translates? Okay, this is my first question. And my second question, if there is time, is, okay, today's class or today's lecture is highlighting a very important issue in the translation, which is the translation of poetry, an area that students do not like to explore due to the difficulties involved or the difficulties they encounter. My question is, Palestinian translators now are doing a lot of job. You know that during the recent war in Gaza, we found many translators, many students of English doing translations online, etc. But the area of poetry is unreachable. Okay, what Dr. Jacobs or what Dr. Jacobs say in this regard? Okay, as a piece of advice to Palestinian translators, should they follow, for example, poetry translation? On poetry translation, which type of translation should they follow? Should they follow, for example, analogical translation or organic translation or prose translation or phonemic translation? We need to set up, okay, translation or a program for poetry translation. But you know, we don't have many translators who like to translate poetry because they say that this area is untranslatable. But today you told us that translation of poetry is translatable. That's my question.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for your really stimulating questions. I think we would need a few lectures together, everybody, to talk about because they're so rich to contemplate. So I'd say, first of all, that from my point of view, any translation strategy and any so of all of the types that we've seen tonight can be acceptable depending on the context. So, for example, if you're wanting to read Mahmoud Darwish, for example, in English translation, you know, one way of translating into English would be for a very literal translation that would enable people like myself who don't know Arabic to see the way in which he uses imagery. So not changing things, even if it might sound a bit awkward. So a very literal translation, even into prose. At the same time, to understand why he's such an amazing poet, it would be great to have a more poetic translation, even that might be simply analogical or mimetic, or even imitation, if that's what it takes to convey the power in the Arabic of Darwish for an English language reader. So to a certain degree, it depends on your readership. And when we're talking about, I mean, I think that Arabic has such a long and an amazing tradition of poetry in which, and I think you have so many readers of poetry compared to the Anglophone, the English-speaking world, where poetry is much less valued today. So I would encourage Palestinian translators to translate into whatever way they want to, that sounds to them, well, that sounds to them like that poem will either live in Arabic and in a way that conveys some of the power of whatever language they're translating from. I mean, in the end, a poetry translator has to try to focus on a specific layer of meaning or a specific type of element that they aim to get across in translation. So, I mean, translations, you can have multiple translations of the same text which show entirely different representations of the source poem. And so that's why the more translations, really, the merrier. And I know poetry translation pays very little, but the rewards just as a translator, I think, can be enormous, because when you're translating a famous poet, it's like you're in a dialogue with them. And so I find it immensely rewarding and beautiful. I don't know if I answered both of your rich questions, but please feel free to come back and ask them in a different way if I can answer them better. I know that in the English-speaking world, it's very rare, in fact, to have any lessons about poetry translation because it's not something that makes money, and so it's very at the university level that they don't want you to teach about a whole class about poetry translation, a whole module about it. Now, I just wanted to end with a couple of things. So we talked about a lot of things so far, but we didn't talk about archaizing translations. So translations that are written in language from centuries ago. So the Divine Comedy has been translated, for example, into medieval French. But Émile Littré, whose translation of the Inferno, the first part of the Divine Comedy, was published in 1879. Well, medieval French was spoken in around 1400. So there's a huge time gap. If you were reading Littré's translation when it was published in 1879 in French, and you were French, you would notice that there was a big difference between contemporary French and what Littré wrote in. And the similar thing happened with Burchard's translation into medieval German in the 1923. So archaizing translations are where you aim to create distance in your translation, because in the end, if you're an Italian, you know, my son Giovanni, who just turned 13, he read some of the Divine Comedy at school this year in Italy, and it was very difficult for him to understand a lot of the terms, a lot of the words, because it was written 7 centuries ago. So some translators want the readership in translation to have that same distance. And that's why, if we're thinking, you know, about Shakespeare, for example, so Shakespeare's plays and his sonnets, which were written 400 to 500 years ago, for an English language reader, they're very difficult to read. But when they're translated into Arabic or whatever language, into contemporary Arabic, they're much easier to be understood by the Arabic reader. In fact, the Arabic reader, I mean, if you present Hamlet translated into contemporary Arabic and Hamlet in English to an English language reader, the Arabic reader would understand much more about what's happening in Shakespeare's play than the English language reader, who would be often unsure about what Shakespeare's even talking about. So translations in that way can be more contemporary than the source text. Okay, so, and I just wanted to close on the notion of, we talked about interlingual translation, which is translation between languages, but there's also intralingual translation, which is translation within the same language. And it would be interesting to hear about this with regard to Arabic. So this comes from the first famous poem in English written about 1,000 years ago called Beowulf. I put, I'll just read these few lines in Old English. Huet, Wegardena, and Gerardegam, Theodisinga, Thruum Gefrunen, Hutha, Ethvelingas, Ellen Fremeden. Now, it probably sounds very bizarre to you. I don't know what it means, really. I took a semester of Old English, but that certainly wasn't enough to teach me how to read this. I have the translation here underneath, but it sounds like another language. This is Old English. It's much more close to German. So there's no way that an English language reader can read Beowulf now without either studying a few years of Old English or else reading it in translation, despite the fact that it's written in so-called English, Old English, and this is intralingual translation. Okay, I think I'll end here. So I'll be happy now to take any and all of your questions that you might have. So please don't be shy. I know I'll learn from your questions as well as you.
Thank you very much. Before Dr. Mahmoud says something, can the students here, the participants, maybe the MA students or the translation students, if they have something, a comment, a question, this is a good chance for you to ask. Go on. You don't have to raise your hand. Go on, Salsabil. You can also type. If you don't want to speak, you can type your question. I'll read it. Go on, Salsabil. Ines, go on.
Hello, Professor Jacob. Thank you so much for having this lecture. I'm very happy to attending.
Actually, thank you.
Yeah, okay. There are 3 points that I want to relate here according to what you said. The first is the definitions of Browning and Valéry, which were two different from each other. But to somehow it was related to foreignization and domestication. I think that foreignization would be literal and domestication would be like, to me, like a free translation. Yeah. However, as you suggested, that Fitzgerald changed a lot of the meaning in his translation. This is why I think that it would be better to foreignize a poem to at least be faithful to the text and culture, as Valéry has just suggested. So it would be like contradicting between what he said and what could be done at the same time. So, but as you suggested, if people couldn't easily understand the same language, like you said that your son couldn't understand Shakespeare's poems because of different, because the time was different. How would a text that is foreignized be easy for others to be understood at the same time? I mean, it's the same language, but at the same, it was the same language, but he couldn't understand. How would it be like if it was different language and it is foreignized?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. Really interesting. So domestication and foreignization, I should have said this before. There are terms that change according to the context, the social cultural context, the literary context. So, for example, now that in the English speaking world, we write poetry without rhyme in free verse. Domestication and foreignization means something different than when 100 years ago English poetry was still written in rhyme. So 100 years ago, domesticating translation into English of poetry would be into rhyme. Whereas nowadays, a domesticating translation would be just into free verse and not into rhyme, because domesticating makes the reader not have to work very hard and reflects their own sort of normal way of reading literature. So as for the question of foreignization, certainly one of the problems with foreignizing translations is the comprehensibility, the understandability of the translation for the target language reader. So on the one hand, if you as a translator foreignize a lot, it might be difficult for your reader to understand and to appreciate the poetic value of the poem. On the other hand, if you domesticate the poem, you lose a lot of the cultural elements of the poem. So it's very much a negotiation, or I mean, to a certain degree, it depends both on what the translator wants to do, whether she or he wants to use a domesticating or foreignization approach, but also what the publisher, if the poem is being published, prefers. Or, you know, publishers will say, okay, you have to translate in this way or in that way, so you don't have an option as a translator. And that's what I explore in my books on sociology. Yeah, I mean, there's no, unfortunately, one size fits all, or just a general way of saying, well, you should translate domestication or foreignization. I think it very much depends on what your aim as a translator is. I hope I answered your questions, but feel free to ask me more.
Thank you very much. Salsabil, go on briefly, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So personally, I love translation, but I have some difficulties translating poems because it contains so much feelings and emotions in them, and it's sometimes hard to translate emotions and feelings. And have you ever read a poem in both languages translated you can read that you find or found different in translating the emotions and feelings, and how you can react to that, and how you can help me in facing this difficulty, because I really want to overcome this difficulty, because I love poems. I recently started reading them, and I really want to proceed translating poems and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think your major point was about translating emotions. Is that correct? Which is a really interesting question, because of course, an emotion that the source readership might feel reading a poem might not be the same that a target reader would feel if you translated that poem in a literal manner. It depends what the emotion is being caused by. I mean, for example, just the idea of nostalgia can be provoked or caused by different feelings. So, for example, if we're talking about, feeling like an exile, that emotion is often very universal, even though it's in different contexts. But for some cultures, it's much more important than for others. It's much more felt strongly. Certainly for all of you, so when you think about Palestinian poetry translated in English, how do you get across that immense emotional effect, the visceral effect in English, where instead your English language reader will not be most of the time being in exile, so they won't know what that means. They won't be able to grasp it emotionally. And if they can't grasp it emotionally, then they won't feel the power of it. So you have to often try to use adaptation or domestication in some way to get across the heart, the beating heart of that emotion in translation. Because even if the words you translate correctly, if the tone of the poem is so important and that's not being brought across in translation, then it can be a failed translation. I don't know if that was helpful.
Yes, it was. Because sometimes I just want to say that sometimes a poem is concentrated on emotion.
One more, one of the guys.
No, Rahaf has raised her hand.
Okay, anybody?
Rahaf, you can go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I want to thank you for the amazing lecture. Second of all, you mentioned something about modularization, I think that's how it's pronounced, and how sometimes you change in the translation to fit, to suit the reader. Now, of course, one of the things I really like about translation is that you can find different translations that suit different readers. But as a literature student, I would usually pick the text that is most faithful to the original text. Especially when it comes to translating literature, like you mentioned Dante and how they deleted the fact that he placed Muhammad and Ali in Inferno. Well, as a literature student, we can write entire researches just about that very simple part. And when you remove that, like you remove a very essential part that is very important when it comes to analyzing the text. So how ethical is it? When we talk about translation, I think that we should be faithful to the original text, and no matter whether what we're translating will be offensive or not, covering up the truth of what is said is not really that ethical to me. So what's your opinion on the matter?
Well, thank you very much for your very fascinating reflections, Raf. So, I mean, let's say that in the Persian context in Iran, it was, I believe, impossible it would have been impossible for a translation of Dante's Inferno to have been published with Muhammad's name present in the text. Certainly, yeah. So I've talked to Iranian scholars of Italian literature who teach in Tehran, and they say that an uncensored version circulates on the internet in Persian, but it's not published in bookstores. I welcome translations that are not censored, but I also understand that in certain contexts, there is political context, there is no way for a translation to be published that is uncensored, like Dante. So I think at a certain point, you have, as a translator, you have to decide, do you want your translation published or not? I do agree that the ethical issues are definitely present, though, as you say. And certainly, if you don't know who Dante is referring to there, you're missing an important aspect of the poem.
Ahmed, go on.
Ahmed?
Yes, thanks, Doctor. Actually, welcome, Dr. Jacob. It's our honor to be with you. I'm Ahmed Lulu, translator and writer, and I'm a student here at the Islamic University of Gaza. Actually, I have one comment, which is regarding to the poetry and translating poetry. So I think that one of the major challenges in translating poetry, as what we have seen, are the devices and nuances that make poetry what it is. So, for example, rhyme is one of the easier devices to mimic in another language, and nearly every culture has rhyming words that are put together in some form, even if only for something as simple as a chant or a way, a word for crying or something like that. So I think in translation, and maybe you can correct for me, Dr. Jacob, in translation, maintaining the rhyme of a poem often means interpreting it in a different way, but without losing the gist of the original piece. So am I right, Doctor?
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for your contribution. I would say that it depends on what sacrifices the translator is making to keep a rhyme scheme. The Divine Comedy by Dante is an excellent example because Dante uses an innovative rhyme scheme he invented himself called terza rima, where the first and third verses rhyme. And the problem for translation of Dante's Italian poem into English is that we have very, very few rhyme words compared to Italian. If we think about the word love, for example, in English, there's only a few words that rhyme with love. Love, I mean, and you can't really decline love. You can say loved, loving, and that's about it. Whereas in Italian, you can say the verb amare can conjugate into 40 or 50 different separate words, which create by themselves 40 or 50 different verb endings, which rhyme with other sorts of words. So an English language translator who tries to use the same sort of rhyme scheme of Dante comes up against very big complications. And what that means is that they will need to make sacrifices and omit information or add a lot of times add words and phrases and images that are not there in Dante's Italian text. So it depends, I think, rhyming on what languages we're talking about. So when you're translating between Semitic languages, for example, that's much easier than when you're translating between, I don't know, a Germanic language and a Semitic language. And it also depends on what the function of rhyme is for the poet, the original author itself, and how important a role rhyme plays.
Thanks, Dr. Jacob. I have also one question, if it's available.
Okay, very briefly, Ahmed, very briefly.
Okay.
A question, not a comment.
Okay, a question. Okay. Sorry, me. Regarding the rhyme, Dr. Jacob, what do you suggest the more appropriate strategy for translating rhyme as maybe we can consider it as the melody element? So is there any maybe suggested techniques or strategies to translate them?
It depends again on what genre of text we're talking about, and what. So, for example, a sonnet has a specific rhyme scheme, or a ballad has a specific rhyme scheme. I'm just thinking of a type of English genres that I know. But I mean, it really depends on if you're translating into Arabic, what the rhyme scheme of the original source text is, and what role that rhyme scheme has, or what prestige it has for the source language, and how you can in some way replicate that in the target language.
Thank you. That's
Thank you,
fair
Ahmed.
enough. Thank you, Dr. Jacob.
Dr. Mahmoud, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to speak about three things quickly. The first point is related to faithfulness or loyalty. Actually, some translators are stuck with the idea of being loyal or faithful. And being loyal and faithful is more closer to prescriptive than descriptive. And in many instances, you have no room or actually to be loyal. Otherwise, you won't sell your work, you won't get your work published. So it's something out of control. We need to come outside this. Now, you cannot, for example, tell an agency which employs you that you must translate this in this way, otherwise they will not accept it. So we need to take this into consideration. This is the first point. The second point is that translation and decision-making in all types of text go along one another. So very briefly, like Dr. Jacob, what do you advise translators, for example, to take into consideration when they translate poetry between different languages? Is it the theme? Is it the rhyme? Is it other things? And my last point is regarding offensive texts. For example, you gave us one example of deletion in the case of Muhammad and Ali. I was wondering if you could, for example, give us other examples where other translation strategies are used. Now, this is understandable. Students may be able to use it between English and Arabic in such context, but are there other strategies which could imply this? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mahmoud, for those questions. So I totally agree with you regarding loyalty and faithfulness. I think they're concepts that, first of all, are quite vague because you can be faithful to a number of different things, but generally faithfulness is understood wrongly as simply being literal in terms of referential meaning, and instead there's so many different layers of meaning in a text, as we've learned over the past few decades, and ambiguities just present in language, that you can be faithful to a number of different things. As for the let me go to your third question first. So in terms of other strategies of translating offensive text, one is translating literally, but using descriptive, well, using footnotes. So that you're able to explain for the target readership, the context of the source text and what the author meant there, and that's one way. I think the other way is to translate it, but not to give any footnotes at all. But I think that's not, especially when you're translating objectionable material, is not an acceptable way. I definitely think what is called thick translation would work. So namely the thick footnotes, long footnotes, but also a faithful translation of the words. The second question. I'm sorry, Dr. Mahmoud,
translation and decision making. I mean, what decision should translator take, for example?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it depends. I hate to it sounds like a cop-out, that I say, it depends on the context. It depends, but I mean, when you're translating a text, when I'm translating poetry, for example, it's different than when I'm translating fiction. I translate fiction because I'm paid to do it, and I don't especially enjoy it, but I know it has to be relatively domesticated, because otherwise the readership will not be happy, and I'm not proud, in fact, of doing it. I hate translating fiction. I prefer to translate poetry because I feel much more freer to adopt different translation strategies that I think will produce an effective poem in English without being forced by a particular readership or publisher to translate in a specific way. So again, it depends on the genre of text that you're translating as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to talk a little bit, probably briefly, before we wrap this up, about my experience.
Yes.
Both translating and mainly translating poetry, and also teaching and training young, promising translators to do this. Number one, I begin with the idea you started with, that it's wrong to assume that it's impossible to translate, because if translation is the art of the impossible, poetry is also the art of the impossible, with all its delicacies and nuts and bolts, like Ahmed suggested just now. So what I usually do is start the course, the training course, with poetry, even with Shakespeare. I start with "Hath not a Jew eyes" with Shylock, and then at the end of the session, I tell them, look how smart you are, how good you are. And sometimes I compare this with canonical translators in the Arabic language. And honestly, we find a lot of good translations like that can be compared to well-established and published translation. And then they start, it's a psychological thing that translation is untranslatable and everything else. So personally, I do this, and I usually recommend my friends to do this with their students. Start with simpler poems, easier poems, with poems that can be translated, so we can break this psychological barrier. I'm really glad with what Rahaf said. She's a senior student, a BA student, but she summarized so many of the things that I have in mind about translation and the loyalty and the foreignization issue. That if we keep deleting part of the text because they're not suitable, because they don't translate, because we're going to end up with a text that is not a text that is not the original text. And with how in sometimes because my PhD is in poetry, and sometimes I tell students, because how many people say that poetry is what gets lost in translation, or poetry what gets found in translation. I tell them some of the things that get lost in translation, I would spend literally hours explaining in my poetry classes. So when they are translated, they're gone like this, and it's really sad, whether it is as minor as the rhyme or as major as the word choice and everything. With Coleridge saying prose is
Rifat.
Yeah, seems there is.
There we go.
I'm usually because they are connected a little bit. I'm usually very criticized because I teach my students to stick to the text, stick to the text, stick to the text, stick to the text. My experience has proven that students. So what I usually do is I bring them a text that is already translated, totally appropriated, totally domesticated, and then I ask them, "Do you know this text?" And they're like, "No, it's new to us." And I say, "No, it is not. It is a translation of this particular poem." And everyone's like, "Oh my God, is this what happens to the poem when we take total freedom?" Because what happens is that students want to really, like literally, almost literally, load the poem with their own expressions, with Arabic idioms, Arabic imagery, Arabic. Doing this is like executing the poem, eradicating, the article that says, there's an article about the erasure of Islam from Rubaiyat al-Khayyam. You totally erase what makes the poem, what makes the text, So that's why I keep pushing my students to a corner where you only have like probably 10-20% of margin to manage some of the issues, but not more than that, or else we will have no text. And that's the point.
A great point. Yes. Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, Rifat. I mean, I think in English nowadays, sometimes we run the risk of going the opposite direction, where it's so literal that you lose the poetic power, because we had for so many centuries what you're talking about now in the Arabic context, that was the way that translation was. So you would always be, as a poetry translator, you'd always be adding things of your own. And we saw with Alexander Pope, his translation of Homer, etc. And so now we've gone back to the point where there's a focus on the literal translation, but then sometimes you lose the idea that this is even a poem in the first place. So it's really challenging. And the question, I guess, as a translator is, well, do you start off? I mean, I think probably the best thing is to start off doing a literal translation, word for word, or at least grammatical. And then once you've fully understood the source text, and you've looked at that allusion, found the allusions and everything, then you can start to try to make it a little bit more poetic, but only once you have a real literal translation. And that's what a lot of people don't do to begin with, I think.
I think Dr. Mohammed has a question.
I have two things first before.
We have 5 minutes. Go on, either Dr. Mohammed or Dr. Mahmoud or both. Go on,
no,
go
Dr.
on.
Mohammed, I already finished. Thank you.
In light or given this background of discussion focusing on, we say the difficulty, we should agree that there is a difficulty of translating poetry, regardless of the direction, Arabic to English or English to Arabic or whatever. In our department, okay, we have BA in English, we have BA in translation, we have MA in translation. In my opinion, okay, given the peculiarities of translating poetry, it could be a good idea, and this is, just a comment or a suggestion, a good idea to work in teams. For example, Dr. Rifat Al-Arir is a lecturer in literature. Dr. Muhammad Al-Hajj Ahmad is a lecturer in translation. We can work together in translating that bit of poetry translation. I mean, and we do this, by the way. For example, 2 months ago, we asked Dr. Rifat to work with us in a workshop, okay, to discuss the topic, an MA thesis concept paper, okay, presented to us on poetry. So I decided to make use of the people of literature or to work in coordination with the people of literature. Okay, I think this is one way of dealing with this issue. Okay, so we have people of literature on one side to look at the literary aspect, and we have people of translation to look at the translation aspect. So together we make sure that the topic is covered or is presented without any problem. So this is my suggestion. Okay, it's not a question. Okay, so the other point is, before we leave, I would like to thank Dr. Jacob and the University of Leeds for the wonderful services they have presented to us. Professor Jeremy Monday, Professor James Dickens, and the others have always been at our hands, really. Okay, and they always coordinate with us and cooperate with us, okay, making lectures online, okay. So please, Dr. Jacob, send my best regards to Dr. Jeremy Monday, Professor Jeremy Monday, and my doctoral supervisor, Professor James Dickens. Tell him we are sending them our best wishes in Gaza, okay, from Gaza, because they have really worked well with the English department, with the teaching staff at the English department. So thank you very much for your lecture and for being with us here. Okay, thank you again, and thank organizers for their efforts on having Dr. Jacob here with us in Gaza, even although online.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. It's been a real pleasure. And I just wanted to say, following up your really interesting point about collaborative translation, that I think that is often an excellent way to translate. I've done that especially with native translators. So, for example, if I translated poetry from Polish with in collaboration with a Polish scholar, I translated Russian poetry with a Russian scholar, and by doing that, you have an expert in the source language and in the target language, and I think that often works quite well.
Abu Omar, Dr. Rafat, do you have?
Okay. I'm having internet connection problems, but thank you. This has been really enlightening. I'm sure everybody who watched live and those who will watch later on are really grateful and thankful to you, Dr. Jacob Blakesley. And like Dr. Muhammad suggested, we hope that this is going to be the beginning of more cooperation, more lectures, and hopefully more projects in the near and far futures.
Yeah, it would be a delight. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming.
Dr. Jacob, I'll upload this to YouTube.
Okay.
And send you the link and share it with our students at the department.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob.
Thanks, everybody.
Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for all of your questions.